Welcome back to the channel. In today's video, we are going to look at a study that might suggest there is a intervention that could improve your balance and your walking after a stroke. So in this video, you're going to learn a little bit about the balance system and what allows us to stay vertical when we're walking, how a stroke affects our ability to maintain vertical after walking, and one potential treatment intervention that could help to improve our ability to maintain vertical when we are walking. If you're new to this channel, I'm Tara, I'm a neurologic physical therapist, and on this channel we talk about anything and everything related to mobility, health, fitness, and mindset with the end goal of empowering you with as many tools as possible to take full ownership of your rehab and your overall health. And all that said, let's first talk about what balance is in a healthy individual, meaning before you had your stroke. Balance is basically our ability to maintain our center of mass within our base of support, i.e. our feet, as well as our ability to quickly and automatically respond when our center of mass is perturbed from our midline. So how do we do this? We do this via multiple sensory inputs that give our brain information. Our brain processes all that information and quickly and automatically responds to ensure that our center of mass stays within our base of support. When our center of mass is perturbed outside our base of support, the structure has a much more challenging time of staying vertical. So what are those inputs? Well, we have inputs from our eyes, so sensory input. We have vestibular input, which is a little organ inside our inner ear. Now, the importance of understanding this little vestibular organ for today's study, the most important thing to know is that that little organ responds to head movement. So when our head is disrupted, that information is extremely important to our brain so our brain can know how to adjust. Vision helps us to maintain orientation to like a horizon line or vertical. We have proprioception, which kind of gives our brain information as to where all of our limbs and everything are located in space. Then we also have like pressure receptors throughout our body, primarily in our feet, not primarily in our feet, but the one that makes the most sense is if you think about it, we have pressure sensors on the bottom of our feet. If that pressure sensation shifts towards one side or you get more pressure on one side of your foot, obviously that would be very helpful information for our brain so our brain could adjust. The big picture to understand about all of these systems is they all work well together. So our head maintaining a vertical position at all times is extremely valuable so that that vestibular system can sense when that head is tilted and our entire body can respond. So if our head always stays in midline or in alignment with our body, if our head notices that adjustment, it does give our brain some information potentially about what the rest of our body is doing so that it can react appropriately to get the entire structure back into that vertical position. Now, that does not necessarily work well independently without also getting information from our eyes, which give feedback as to where our body is in reference to like a horizon line. Okay, so those two work very, very closely together. And vestibular and vision work really well if you're getting that additional information of those pressure receptors on the bottom of our feet, as well as joint angles. So like if we tip forward a little bit and we bend at our hip, that proprioceptive information of that kind of tip in our body is also really helpful because it allows our brain and our brain to work with our body to make the necessary adjustment again to maintain our center of mass, the heaviest part of our body within our base of support. So the balance systems, proprioception, sensation, vision, auditory, All of those things are not only appropriate for maintaining our center of mass within our base of support, but also that information is absolutely critical for making sure we make the appropriate adjustments to our body to reposition our center of mass within our base of support. Okay, so that's kind of big picture. I've made a lot of videos on this channel regarding like more in depth as far as balance. So I highly recommend that you go back and you watch some of those videos, and I'll actually put a link in the description below where I do talk about that more in depth. But that is an absolutely essential foundation when we get to this very hopeful study that just came out a couple of years ago that looked at a potential intervention that we could be doing with patients that have had a stroke to improve your balance and improve your walking, okay? But next, let's talk about what happens after you have a stroke as far as all of these systems that we just talked about. One thing that they know, or that the investigators in this study, pulling from other previous studies, have stated is that primarily after a stroke, patients become visually dependent, meaning the primary way that someone after a stroke maintains their balance is with their vision, which makes perfect sense for any of you that have had a stroke. Try standing and closing your eyes. For many of you, that is a no-go. That's a non-negotiable. You just won't do it because you immediately feel dizzy. You get a little bit anxious, and that is because you primarily use your vision to maintain your balance. Now, why is this so important when it comes to walking, and why some of you don't have as much walking confidence as you did before your stroke is walking is dynamic. And so there's a lot of things changing with our center of mass and our base of support, and requires a very close relationship between all these sensory systems that I just talked about, our brain's ability to integrate those systems quickly and automatically and interact with our body appropriately to make sure we're making those ongoing adjustments while we're in motion. So one intervention that many therapists use after a stroke, or really with a lot of balance disorders, is we will deprive sensation. Now, the purpose of doing that, or having someone work on balance with their eyes closed or with some kind of a patch over their eyes, is so that you can kind of strengthen these other sensations that maybe aren't, or these other systems that maybe aren't getting utilized as much. So when you close your eyes, it really forces you to have to rely more on some of that sensory information, some of that vestibular information, and some of that proprioceptive information, really paying attention to where is my body in space via these kind of proprioceptors that we have throughout our body. Now, there's a good side and a bad side to these kind of like sensory deprivation exercises. One downside of this is it's really hard for someone to do on their own because of that anxiety that occurs as soon as you close your eyes, and because sometimes it's just not safe. So that's really important to understand, that even when I go through this study and talk about kind of how it was designed and some of the interventions that they did, just know that I'm sharing this with you because it is things that investigators are looking at within this space of improving someone's walking, or someone who's had a stroke, improving their walking and their balance after stroke. But this intervention in particular that we're going to talk about, it is extremely hard to do on your own. But why do I bring this to you? Because some of you are working with physical therapists, and I'll put a link to this article in the description below. And maybe it's a discussion that you can have with your therapist as to whether or not these interventions, or this particular intervention, might be beneficial for you. So what did they do in this study? Well, instead of just doing sensory deprivation, which we've definitely been using for years and years and years in physical therapy, they added another component to the treatment intervention where they had a therapist hold someone's head in midline. I've done this before, and it definitely does improve someone's ability to maintain their balance with their eyes closed, or they react a little bit more appropriately. And one of the reasons is because you're kind of setting the vestibular system up for success. So if someone doesn't have the ability to maintain their head in midline, then the information that the vestibular system is giving to the brain might be a little bit skewed or faulty. Okay, so there's two things that are probably happening when you hold someone's head in midline. One is that it's also influencing some of those other sensory inputs, meaning that if you're holding someone's head in midline, probably that proprioceptive input that's coming in might be a little bit more accurate as well. But also, that vestibular information is going to be a lot more accurate. So one more little side note about that vestibular system. So what is this vestibular organ? The vestibular organ is made up of little canals that are all positioned on different axes. Okay. And each of those canals, they're like little tubules that are round like this, and they all sit on a little bit of a different axis. They have little beads inside of them, and on the inside of those tubules, there's these little hairs, and when those beads start spinning, they kind of stimulate those little hairs inside that canal, and that canal picks up on that and sends that information back to the brain that there's something being stimulated in this canal on this particular angle. So that means that our head or our head position is probably moving in a certain direction. It's all dependent on which way you tip your head. That'll stimulate the crystals or the little beads inside one of those canals to start spinning. That information is sent to the brain and kind of gives our brain information as to which direction the head is moving. Very, very important in this entire balance system as one component that can help us to react appropriately when we're off balance. Now, if you don't have good head control, you could see how that would impact those crystals. But if you maintained the head control in middle, you can see how maybe that information is going to be a little bit more accurate that's getting to the brain. So in this study, they had 3 groups. They had 2 experimental groups and a control group. The first experimental group was they covered someone's eyes and they controlled head movement, and they did some balance retraining. The second group, they covered someone's eyes. They did some balance training, but they didn't control head movement. And then the third group, they did some balance retraining without covering someone's eyes and without controlling head movement. Some of the balance interventions that they did were single leg standing, heel to toe standing, standing on one leg, trunk rotation, sit to stands, and stand to sit. Now, one thing that I do think is important to know about this is that they started each treatment session with about 10 minutes of balance with eyes open. And I do think that that is a critical component. So I don't think any of you should be, if you have a balance problem, should be doing this on your own. But for the therapists that might be watching, it is important to kind of start with the eyes open just so that the body can adapt and to decrease some of the anxiety and the fear that'll come along with closing someone's eyes. Get someone comfortable with some of these balance activities before you ask them to close their eyes. And then some of the things that they tested pre and post were static standing balance, including limits of stability. So limits of stability is the amount that your center of gravity, your body, can be displaced kind of towards the edges of your base of support prior to you having to incorporate or execute or deploy some sort of a balance reaction. Okay, so we call those the limits of stability. How far can you go before you have to have some sort of a balance reaction so that you don't fall? And then they looked at dynamic, standing balance, and gait analysis. The 2 things that stood out to me as far as that gait analysis were cadence, the frequency of your steps in a certain amount of time, and stride length. And what did they find? Before I get into that, it's important to know this was an extremely small study. I think there were 45 participants. So with all of these articles that I share, that I look at, most of them are going to be small just because it's really hard to get large cohorts of people that have had a stroke to stay in a study for a prolonged period of time. Two limitations for most studies looking at someone who's had a stroke is there's a lot of heterogeneity, meaning there is a vast difference between stroke location and how someone presents. And in my experience, in many cases, they group a lot of different types of strokes together. And in this one, it does not look like that this is any different. The one thing that was consistent was the length of time since the stroke. I think it was about 2 years. So everyone in this study was in what they call the chronic phase. So they were past that 2-year mark. But please keep in mind, there are tons of variations on how someone would respond to this type of an intervention depending on where their stroke was at. Things that come to mind just from my own experience is if you had a stroke in your cerebellum, that would be very, very different from someone who had stroke in kind of more of like their frontal lobe, or more of a stroke where it was like the primary motor cortex. Very, very different. Some people that have had strokes deep in their brainstem is also going to be very, very different. Or like someone who's had a stroke in their thalamus, which doesn't directly impact like a motor area, but a lot of motor information has to go through the thalamus in order to be able to execute some of these movements. You could see how each one of those types of brain, where the brain was damaged or injured, is really going to impact how someone would respond to this type of intervention. One other thing I will say is the side of the brain, right versus left. In my experience, people that have had a stroke that's involved the right side of the brain, those people will have more spatial awareness difficulties, also more difficulty maintaining attention to an activity like this. So I do think, and they are a little bit less inhibited. I think I said that right, meaning their inhibitions are down. So their ability to suppress some of the anxiety that an intervention like this might bring on would also make this a little bit more challenging. So the researchers here, the investigators, they didn't really mention that in the discussion of right hemisphere versus left hemisphere. But in my experience, I definitely think that there would be a dramatic difference between how someone would respond that's had this type of intervention based on what side of the brain was impacted. Now, again, based on my experience, I think that the ideal candidate for this type of intervention would be someone that has had a stroke more on the left side of the brain, and someone that doesn't involve the cerebellum or the occipital lobe, or like a large stroke in the brainstem. Those would be areas of the brain where I think it would be much, much more of a challenge. What did they find in this very, very small study? That there were some improvements in cadence and stride length in the first group compared to the other two groups. So group without where someone wasn't doing the head control, and the control group, and what they're calling like some clinically significant improvements in dynamic standing balance. They found that in both the first group and the second group, but not in the control group. So meaning both groups where visual deprivation was part of the intervention had some improvements in dynamic balance. What does this type of a study really highlight, for me at least, is that most people after a stroke are heavily, heavily, heavily dependent on visual input. And that can be problematic on multiple levels. One is being able to get dressed and standing, pulling a shirt on over your head, washing your hair. Those moments where you do close your eyes, it makes those situations a little bit more risky for someone who's had a stroke. The other thing that I think this study highlights is that we become, or someone who's had a stroke becomes visually dependent, but not in all cases did the stroke or the area of the brain that was damaged impact those somatosensory inputs and those proprioceptive inputs. And this is what I would call maybe like a learned non-use. So I do talk about a learned non-use phenomena that occurs after a stroke a lot when it comes to compensation and becoming really strong on your uninvolved side. It's just something that happens after a stroke that our brain adapts and reorganizes. And the more we allow those adaptations to kind of dominate our movement. So when it comes to movement, the more we just only use our uninvolved side, the brain actually reorganizes around that and starts to kind of devote more energy or attention to making those areas of the brain that weren't injured, make them be responsible for more functions in the brain. So the uninjured side of the brain actually starts to take over for some of the damaged areas of the brain. And I think this is probably a similar phenomena that if you become just dependent on using your vision all the time, that it's kind of like those areas of your brain, somatosensation, proprioception, your vestibular system, they don't get as much work and they kind of become weaker. Now, here's one problem that I do see with this study is that the first group that had the intervention, someone was like actually holding their head. And I will just tell you, or they were provided with verbal cues to correct their head if their head wasn't in midline. Now, why is this important? Because in my experience, I've done this. And one reason why sometimes I will remove my cues from someone's head is because that too is sensory feedback that a person starts responding to. So what do I mean by that? When I'm physically holding someone's head, if they start to tip in one direction, like their entire body, there are pressure sensors on our skull. And sometimes I've noticed that people are just responding to those pressure sensors, which is not realistic. That's not, that's never going to be a sensation that someone's going to be able to use to help them maintain their balance. So I will only do that for a brief period of time as far as holding someone's head in midline. And it has to be so severe that there's no verbal cues in the world where someone's going to be able to know what I mean when I say straighten your head up with their eyes closed, right? So I do think that's a limitation of this study because there's no way for these researchers to kind of know that. I would say, why do I say that? Is I think that I would have loved it if this study was maybe done in another manner where the head was maintained in midline with even maybe a collar or something where someone couldn't respond to the pressure of my fingertips if their body was tipping in one direction or another. So I do think that that's kind of a limitation of the study, but also in general, this study just re-highlights some of the things that we know as therapists that we should probably not neglect, and that is postural control. And for you, as someone who's maybe had a stroke, is working on your postural control, working on your ability to keep your entire body in vertical, including your head. And for those of you that keep your head kind of tilted to one side and you get a little bit annoyed when your family members correct you or try and get you to kind of look straight ahead, it is extremely valuable. And that some form of visual deprivation, whether that be in sitting, where it would be a little bit safer, I think there's some value in that, or with a therapist, because again, I don't think this is necessarily safe for a lot of you to do on your own, but I know a lot of you have personal trainers and you have therapists that you work with, that maybe some sort of visual deprivation training could be extremely beneficial. I hope you guys found this video helpful. I will put a link for this video in the description below. If you are someone who has worked on visual deprivation activities with your therapist, have they been effective? Do you find that it does make you more confident afterwards when you are walking on your own? Do you feel like you can walk a little bit faster, or maybe that your stride length is a little bit longer, which could indicate in some cases that you feel a little bit more confident? I would love to know what your personal experiences have been if you have worked on sensory deprivation with your therapist. But that is it for this video. If you're new to this channel and you like this kind of video and you want to see more videos like this, definitely hit that subscribe button and turn on that notification bell so that you will get notified every time I upload new videos. Don't forget, we do have a membership program. With our base membership program, you do get access to all the PDF handouts that we make for each of these videos. In those PDF handouts, if it's exercises, we get pictures and descriptions of all the exercises so that you just have a convenient handout to take with you when you go to do your exercises. But when we do videos like this, we put like a one-page PDF handout together that just kind of hits all of the bullets from this video and from the study. So if you are a member, you do get access to those PDF handouts. So if you want to learn more about our membership program and to sign up, please visit rehab-hq.com. I enjoyed spending time with you all today, and I'll see you in the next video. Have a good day.